At a rally with over 2,000 Trump supporters, Michelle Obama walked in uninvited. The moment Donald Trump saw her, he told security, "Remove her." Security started moving. The crowd was ready to cheer her removal, but then she raised her hand, calmly, and said just 6 words that froze the entire room. "Give me 60 seconds, that's all." What happened next? Nobody could have predicted. There were no chants, no shouting, no insults, just one voice, steady, honest, and deeply human. And in that silence, even Trump didn't interrupt. Why did Trump's supporters start applauding her? And what did she say that made lifelong supporters of Trump, who told her to leave, stand up and clap for her instead? And to better understand this story, we have to go back to where it all began. It was just another Trump rally, at least that's how it started. Inside the cavernous convention hall in Dallas, the air was thick with excitement. Over 2,000 people had shown up early, waving banners, sipping from red and blue thermoses, and snapping selfies in front of oversized American flags. The atmosphere felt less like a political event and more like a rock concert. Trump had barely stepped onto the stage before the crowd was already roaring, chanting his name, and cheering on his familiar performance. He opened with easy laughs, mocking the press, ridiculing liberals, and tossing in a few zingers about electric vehicles and woke universities. The crowd responded like they always did, laughter rolling like thunder, claps timed perfectly with his punchlines. A man in the middle row turned to his wife and joked, "If he runs in 2028, I'll vote again just for the stand-up routine." She chuckled, sipping from her Women for Trump cup, replying, "He's the only one who says what we're all thinking." It was a well-oiled machine. Chants, jokes, applause, repeat. But something changed. It didn't happen loudly. It didn't happen all at once. It began at the edge of the press section, subtle, almost invisible at first. A figure emerged from the shadows, walking slowly but with unmistakable presence. She wasn't wearing campaign buttons or media badges. No camera followed her. No staff flanked her. Just a woman in a dark blazer, composed, measured. At first, no one recognized her. They assumed she was part of the crew, maybe an organizer arriving late. But then her face came into focus. Someone near the aisle whispered, "Wait a second, is that..." Another leaned forward, squinting. "That's not possible." It was. A woman from row 8 tapped her husband and pointed nervously. "Is that Michelle Obama?" He raised an eyebrow, then leaned back and smirked. "Look who wandered in. Did CNN send her for the ratings?" A few people laughed awkwardly, but underneath the laughter was something else. A shift, a silence, a new kind of tension settling into the room. Donald Trump didn't see her right away. He was still riffing, grinning, soaking in the cheers, riding the wave of his own momentum. But then, in a brief moment between jokes, his gaze swept the crowd and locked onto her. The grin faded, the confidence cracked. His body stiffened behind the podium, and for a split second, his voice faltered. Then, into the microphone, low, sharp, unscripted, came 2 words that sliced through the room like a blade. "Remove her." It wasn't the performance voice. It wasn't the campaign showman. It was something else. Something colder. Security moved instantly. 2 men in black suits emerged from the shadows, eyes locked on her as they began to close in. The crowd, still unsure whether to laugh or boo, began to stir. A few people shouted, "Get her out." Others leaned forward, phones raised, ready to record the humiliation. This wasn't just about politics anymore. This was about dominance, control, and the crowd wanted to see her escorted out in shame. But Michelle Obama didn't move. She didn't flinch. She didn't glance toward the exits or search for backup. She stood where she was, eyes forward, posture strong. The guards were just steps away when she did something so simple, it brought the entire room to a halt. She raised her hand, not in protest, not in panic, but in calm authority. Her voice, when it came, was low but unshakable. "Give me 60 seconds, that's all." The words weren't shouted, they didn't need to be. They settled into the air like weight, pulling every eye, every breath toward her. The crowd froze. Security hesitated. Even Trump, known for never yielding a second of silence, stayed still. Because in that moment, no one knew what to do with her. She wasn't yelling. She wasn't disrupting. She was simply asking to be heard, and doing it in a way that made ignoring her feel wrong. The silence that followed wasn't accidental. It was earned. It was the kind of silence that comes when power enters the room, but refuses to announce itself. Michelle didn't demand respect. She radiated it. And for the first time in years, inside a Trump rally known for its noise, its volume, and its certainty, there was stillness. One voice, steady, honest, deeply human, had paused an entire machine built to overwhelm. And as Trump stared, unsure, the guards stood still, and the audience waited. Something undeniable took hold. What was supposed to be a moment of humiliation was beginning to feel like something else. Something dangerous to those who thrive on chaos. Something transformative for those who have been told to sit down and stay quiet. Michelle Obama had spoken 6 words, and the room would never be the same. Michelle stood there, still beneath the stage, not towering, not commanding attention through stature, but somehow pulling every gaze in the room with gravity alone. The silence around her felt fragile, like a glass floor suspended above decades of division. She didn't rush to fill it. She let it breathe. And then, without changing her tone or posture, she smiled gently, just enough to soften the tension, and spoke. "I used to pass this building every day," she said, her voice low but resonant. "On the bus to school. I was just a skinny black girl with a backpack too big for her shoulders, wondering if anyone inside here would ever listen to someone like me." The line hit with unexpected lightness. A few people in the crowd tilted their heads. One older man near the center, arms crossed tightly just moments ago, let out a surprised chuckle. "She's got guts," he murmured. His wife elbowed him gently, whispering, "Be quiet." But even she couldn't help the half-smile tugging at her lips. The crowd didn't roar. It didn't boo. It didn't chant. It just listened. For the first time in a long time, a Trump rally became a room of attention instead of reaction. And Michelle, reading the room like someone who had walked into uncomfortable spaces her whole life, leaned into that stillness, not to exploit it, but to respect it. She went on, still casual, still controlled. "I never thought I'd step inside this place, let alone speak in front of so many folks who probably didn't come here to hear from me," she said. "And believe me, I didn't come to pick a fight. I just came because silence, especially in times like these, isn't something I can live with anymore." Her tone had the ease of a neighbor speaking across a fence post, not a public figure delivering a speech. That made it disarming. Disarming enough that a few more in the crowd actually lowered their phones, not to stop recording, but to stop hiding behind them. The laughter from earlier hadn't faded completely. It hovered, uncertain, waiting to see what would come next. And what came next would make that laughter vanish in an instant. Michelle's smile faded, her tone shifting ever so slightly, not to anger, but to something colder, sharper, more precise. "You know," she said, "I've spent my life in rooms like this. Rooms where I had to prove I was qualified, where I had to explain why my voice mattered. Rooms where, if I didn't speak loud enough, no one heard me, and if I spoke too loud, I was called angry." The silence in the hall thickened. She wasn't raising her voice, not even close, but every word landed like a stone tossed into a glass lake. And that's the truth, isn't it? We say we want dialogue, but we don't mean it. We want agreement. We want applause. We want to listen only to those who already sound like us. She looked out at the crowd, not confrontationally, but directly. If someone has a different story, a different skin color, a different history, we tune them out. Or worse, we try to remove them. Even Trump, standing stiffly at the edge of the stage, didn't interrupt. He shifted his weight from one foot to the other, gripping the podium with both hands, eyes fixed on her like a man unsure whether to strike or surrender. Michelle continued, not because she had something to prove, but because the silence was proof enough. "You were ready to cheer when they told me to leave," she said softly. "But I'm still here. I'm not yelling. I'm not pointing fingers. I'm just asking, if my quiet voice threatens you, what does that say about your confidence in your own?" No one moved. No one shouted back. No one even cleared their throat. And that was the most remarkable part. She didn't command the room through force. She commanded it through presence. In that moment, something unspeakable happened. The crowd that had come expecting to see an opponent fall was now watching a woman rise without raising her voice. Her calm was disruptive. Her stillness was louder than any chant they had prepared, and her words, carried not in volume but conviction, struck the crowd deeper than anyone expected. They weren't prepared for truth to sound so calm, and that's what made it unforgettable. Michelle Obama wasn't just speaking. She was redefining what power could look like in a room built for noise. And in doing so, she left everyone, including Donald Trump, without a single word in response. For a few long seconds, the silence inside the convention hall felt like an unfamiliar guest, awkward, uninvited, but strangely welcome. Then, softly, almost too soft to hear, came the whisper of a woman seated near the middle aisle. "She's not what I expected," she said, eyes still locked on Michelle. The man beside her, older, stern-faced, arms crossed since the beginning of the rally, nodded slowly and mumbled, "She's making more sense than half of Congress." It wasn't a joke, not really, but somehow it sparked a ripple. A quiet chuckle from behind them, another near the side wall, not mocking, not dismissive, just surprised. Nervous laughter, the kind that comes when people realize they've misjudged a moment and aren't quite sure what to do next. A man near the back lowered his phone and said under his breath, "Well, this is different." Another, wearing a camouflage MAGA hat, looked toward the stage, then back at Michelle, then at the security guards who still stood frozen mid-command. "You think he's gonna stop her?" he whispered to his buddy. But even as he asked, he could sense the answer. Something unexplainable was happening. Not chaos, not confrontation, but a shift. The rally wasn't behaving like a rally anymore. People weren't shouting down the outsider. They were watching her, listening, not because they agreed, but because they couldn't look away. The predictable rhythm of the evening, cheer, laugh, attack, repeat, had been broken. Michelle hadn't stormed in with volume or fury. She had entered like a question no one knew how to answer, and now that question was sitting in the middle of the room, waiting. Up on stage, Donald Trump didn't move for several beats. His face was unreadable, no grin, no smirk, just a tight-lipped stare, as if calculating the weight of every breath. He finally leaned into the microphone, his voice low and tense. "Fine," he muttered, the word pulled through clenched teeth. 60 seconds. Say something brilliant. The crowd didn't erupt this time. No cheers, no chants. Just the hum of confusion and curiosity. Trump's tone wasn't sarcastic like before. It was laced with something else. Resignation. Maybe even the faintest hint of respect, though he'd never admit it. He didn't invite her to the stage. He didn't need to. Michelle didn't move an inch upward. She stayed right where she was, beneath the platform, not beneath the moment. There was something in the way she stood, spine straight, shoulders relaxed, that made her feel taller than anyone in the room. She didn't raise her voice. She didn't raise her arms. But somehow, she raised the stakes. Her presence below the podium was deliberate, a statement in itself. She wasn't here to compete for the spotlight. She was here to say something that didn't need a stage to matter. She looked out at the audience again, eyes steady, voice calm. Then she spoke words that didn't just hit the air, they pierced it. "If you have to silence someone to win an argument," she said slowly, "you've already lost." The line hung there, untouched, unchallenged. It wasn't shouted, it wasn't dramatic, but it shook the ground beneath the rally's foundation. In one sentence, Michelle had flipped the rules of engagement. She didn't accuse, she didn't insult. She simply named what everyone had been pretending not to see. And for a brief, breathtaking moment, even Trump, who had built his brand on volume, had nothing left to say. The words were still echoing in the room long after Michelle stopped speaking. She didn't elaborate, didn't defend, didn't ask for a reaction. She simply held the space with the kind of grace that doesn't demand applause, it earns it. For a few seconds, no one dared move. Then, from the back right corner of the hall, a single clap broke the silence. It wasn't confident. It wasn't even particularly loud, but it was undeniable. All eyes turned to the man wearing a red golf shirt, his face flushed with hesitation, but his hands still moving. The sound was awkward, even uncomfortable, but real. A second later, another clap joined from a few rows up, then another. It wasn't a standing ovation, not yet, but it was something far rarer in that room, genuine respect. People looked around, unsure if they were allowed to react. The usual tribal lines had blurred. The crowd was no longer one collective voice. It had become a series of individuals, each processing what they'd just witnessed in real time. A man near the center leaned toward his wife, his voice barely above a whisper. "I don't agree with her," he said, eyes still fixed on Michelle, "but I heard her." His wife didn't reply. She just reached over and touched his hand. That was the kind of moment no rally scriptwriter could have designed, and suddenly, the room didn't feel like a rally anymore. It felt like something had cracked open, something uncomfortable, yes, but honest. Michelle didn't wait for permission. She didn't bask in the moment. As the scattered applause faded, she gave a soft nod to no one in particular and turned away from the stage. Her steps were slow, deliberate, not retreating, not triumphant, just steady. She walked back toward the rear of the hall and took a seat in an empty chair near the exit. No one stopped her. No one dared. The security guards, who just minutes earlier had been preparing to escort her out, now stood frozen, their authority quietly unraveled. She didn't need a microphone anymore. Her voice had already done what voices rarely do in political spaces. It lingered. Up on stage, Trump adjusted the microphone and cleared his throat. The moment had slipped from his grasp, and he knew it. He forced a smile, one that didn't quite land, and said, "Well, I think we've all had our civics lesson for the day. Can we get back to fixing the country now?" A few people laughed on cue, but the energy was different, thinner, less certain. The audience didn't roar back to life. They didn't return to chanting, because the rhythm had been broken, and the old songs didn't quite fit anymore. For the first time in years, a space built for spectacle had been transformed by stillness, and the man who built his brand on volume had been upstaged by a woman who never once raised her voice. The moment was barely over before it began to multiply. Phones had recorded it from every angle, grainy vertical clips, shaky frames, bad lighting. But none of that mattered. The story wasn't in the visuals. It was in the silence. And silence travels fast when it's wrapped in something real. Within minutes, the first video clips hit Twitter. By the time Michelle was sitting quietly in the back of the room, the internet was already exploding. One tweet read, "Michelle Obama walked into a Trump rally like it was brunch." Another joked, "She gave the room a TED Talk without touching the stage." A third said simply, "She didn't raise her voice. She raised the bar." The replies poured in like rain. Disbelief, admiration, some confusion, and yes, the usual rage. But even that felt oddly muted. Social media, so often a weapon of division, had found something else that night: curiosity. Users across the political spectrum shared the clip not to mock, but to marvel. Some couldn't believe she had the nerve. Others couldn't believe she didn't need to shout. People began debating not just what she said, but how she said it. There were memes within the hour. Michelle standing calm while chaos buzzed around her, superimposed with the words, "Composure greater than clout." Someone edited dramatic movie music under her quote, "If you have to silence someone to win an argument, you've already lost." And it racked up 100,000 likes by midnight. This wasn't just a moment. It was a message, and the internet had delivered it directly into millions of homes. Within 2 hours, the original video had crossed 1 million views. Every major news outlet had picked it up, some cautiously, others with urgency. CNN led with Michelle Obama sparks unexpected moment of unity at Trump rally. MSNBC called it the 60 seconds that froze the right. Even Fox News couldn't ignore it, though their tone leaned harder on questioning motives than reflecting meaning. Still, something had shifted even there. A guest on a conservative panel admitted, "Look, I don't like her politics, but you have to admit, she owned that room." Right-wing pundits scrambled to control the narrative. Some called it a PR stunt. Others accused her of baiting Trump. A few dug up old speeches to claim it was all rehearsed. But none of it stuck, because if it had been staged, it would have been louder, flashier, more polished. Instead, it had been raw, uninvited, and somehow unforgettable. And the data didn't lie. The most shared clips weren't of Trump. They weren't of chants or protests or scuffles. They were of Michelle Obama standing beneath the stage, speaking plainly into a moment that wasn't built for her, and changing it without raising her voice. In a world where viral content is often fueled by outrage, her quiet dismantling of the room broke the algorithm in a new way. People weren't watching to get angry. They were watching because they had felt something. She hadn't attacked. She hadn't performed. She had told the truth and done it with a whisper instead of a war cry. And somehow, in this age of noise, that whisper was what no one could stop hearing. The rally had long ended, and the lights inside the hall had begun to dim. Most of the crowd had filtered out, some still buzzing from what they'd just witnessed, others avoiding eye contact as they passed one another in silence. Outside, the night was warm and breezy, the kind of air that carries conversations just a little farther than usual. Michelle had stepped quietly through a side exit, trying not to draw attention. She wasn't looking for interviews or praise. She just needed a few breaths of clean air and a quiet path back to her car. Her team trailed behind at a respectful distance, understanding that whatever had happened inside wasn't meant to be chased. It was meant to be absorbed. That's when she heard footsteps, quick, uncertain, but getting closer. She turned to see a young woman in a denim jacket and jeans hurrying toward her. She looked nervous but determined, clutching a folded piece of paper in one hand. "Mrs. Obama?" the young woman asked breathlessly. Michelle stopped, turned fully to face her, and nodded gently. The woman smiled shyly. "I don't want to take your time. My dad's a trucker. He's voted for Trump every election. He dragged me here tonight, to be honest." She laughed nervously, then softened. "But after you spoke, he went quiet. I've never seen that before. He just sat there, didn't say a word all the way to the parking lot." Michelle tilted her head, listening, saying nothing yet. The young woman held out the folded note. "He doesn't do Twitter or any of that," she explained, "but he told me if I found you, I should give you this." Michelle accepted it with both hands, smiling warmly. "Thank you," she said, and for a brief moment, the two women just stood there, strangers connected by something neither of them could quite define. The young woman blinked rapidly as if holding back tears. I think, I think you gave him something tonight, she said. Not agreement, but maybe a reason to think again. After the young woman walked away, Michelle stood still under the lamplight, unfolding the paper slowly. The handwriting was rough, jagged, the kind that spoke of calloused fingers and years on the road. There were no flowery words, no long reflections, just one line, centered in the middle of the page, written in a shaky but deliberate hand. I still don't agree with you, but I listened, and that's more than I've done in a long time. Michelle stared at it. The words didn't shout, they didn't flatter, but they hit her harder than any applause ever could. Her eyes welled up, and for a few seconds, she let herself feel it, let the weight of it settle in her chest. This was why she had come, not to go viral, not to make a statement, but for this. For someone like that man, quiet, stubborn, unmoved for years, to finally pause long enough to hear. She had walked into a space designed to reject her, had stood where no one wanted her to stand, and had asked for just 60 seconds. Now, that 60 seconds had echoed all the way into the heart of someone who had stopped listening long ago. She folded the note back up, tucked it carefully into her coat pocket, and looked toward the horizon. Around her, the parking lot had grown quiet. The reporters were gone. The chants were a memory. But in her hand, she carried something worth more than a headline. Not victory, not validation. Just proof that even the smallest crack in a wall can let light in. And that sometimes the hardest thing to do, listening, is the most powerful act of all. The private lounge behind the stage was designed to be a refuge, a plush, closed-off room where Trump could unwind between speeches, surrounded by loyal staff, catered snacks, and controlled lighting that made even bad news feel manageable. But tonight, that refuge had turned into a pressure cooker. The moment the door slammed behind him, Trump erupted. "Who let her in?" he shouted, his voice sharp and cracked with fury. He was pacing in tight, erratic circles, red-faced, eyes darting between aides who were too afraid to answer. "I want names." Now she wasn't on the list. "She's not even supposed to be in the building." One staffer tried to speak. "Sir, we think she came in under Representative Evans's guest credential," but he was cut off by the sound of a plastic water bottle smacking the wall and bouncing harmlessly onto the carpet. "Don't give me excuses," Trump snapped. "You think this was an accident? That wasn't a speech. That was a setup, a media ambush, a staged stunt. She knew exactly what she was doing." He threw himself down into the nearest armchair, fuming, legs bouncing, hands twitching against the armrests. The TV in the corner of the room was already playing clips from the moment, low-quality phone footage, but the image was clear. Michelle Obama, standing in front of the stage, voice steady, head held high. Even the sound from the TV didn't soften it. She hadn't needed amplification. She'd taken the room without asking. Trump growled under his breath, glaring at the screen. "She didn't come here to speak. She came to steal the show." Another aide cautiously offered, "It's all over social media." "Might be best to ignore it for now." Trump's eyes flashed. "Ignore it? She hijacked my rally and made me look like a sideshow, and you want me to ignore it?" In the corner of the room, leaning against the wall with arms folded, stood Patrick Monroe, Trump's longtime advisor and one of the few voices he still halfway listened to when the room spun out of control. Patrick had watched the entire thing in silence, jaw clenched, brow furrowed, not in anger, but in contemplation. Now, he stepped forward, cautiously, but deliberately. "Look," he said, voice low, firm. "You didn't lose the room, but you didn't own it either." The tension in the lounge crystallized instantly. Trump turned toward him slowly, eyes narrowing. "What did you just say?" Patrick didn't flinch. "You didn't lose them, but for 60 seconds, you weren't the center of it. She was." Trump's face hardened. He looked back at the TV, where the clip had frozen on Michelle's face, caught mid-sentence, no emotion, no movement, just composure. The room was still. He studied it longer than anyone expected, and then, for the first time that night, his voice dropped to something barely above a whisper. "She didn't yell," he said quietly, almost to himself. "She just stood there." He leaned forward, elbows on his knees, still staring at the screen like it was speaking to him in a language he hadn't heard before. The swagger was gone. The punchlines dried up. And for the first time in years, Donald Trump sat in a room full of loyalists, with nothing clever to say. In that moment, something became clear, not just to Patrick, but to everyone watching him. The man who had built an empire on owning the room, on commanding the air, on volume and spectacle and dominance, had finally been met with something he couldn't mock. A woman who had spoken without attacking, stood without threatening, and won the room without taking the stage. For Trump, it wasn't just the silence that unsettled him. It was the fact that for the first time in a very long time, he wasn't the loudest voice in the building. And that silence, it echoed louder than anything he'd ever shouted. Back at the quiet hotel suite later that night, Michelle sat on a sofa near the window, her shoes off, blazer folded neatly on the armrest beside her. The city outside was glowing, unaware that something inside the convention hall hours earlier had just altered the tone of national discourse. Her team, always buzzing after big moments, shuffled in and out of the suite, checking notifications, answering emails, dodging phone calls from every news outlet imaginable. On the coffee table, her phone buzzed with a flood of messages. One text read, "You broke the internet without breaking a sweat." Her longtime press aide, Angela, peeked in holding a laptop and half laughing, half shaking her head. "Fox News wants a sit-down interview," she said with mock drama. "Think they'll be nice this time." Michelle smiled, leaned her head back against the cushion, and replied without missing a beat. "I already said what needed saying." The room chuckled, not because it was a joke, but because it was true. There was nothing left to clarify, nothing to double down on. She hadn't come to ignite controversy. She had simply spoken. And somehow, in a political culture obsessed with confrontation, that had become headline-worthy. Angela sat down beside her, scrolling through reactions online, murmuring, "People are calling it a quiet revolution." Michelle raised an eyebrow. "Quiet revolution," she repeated softly, tasting the words. "Isn't that something?" The laughter in the room eventually faded into a deeper kind of silence. Not the uncomfortable kind, but the thoughtful kind that lingers when something sacred has been shared. Michelle looked out the window, the city lights reflecting faintly in her eyes. Then, more to herself than anyone else, she said, "You know what I regret? I regret that speaking softly is now considered radical, that telling the truth without yelling makes headlines, that being calm is seen as a strategy instead of a strength." Her voice didn't carry weight because of its volume. It carried weight because it came from a place of lived understanding. They want you to shout so they can discredit you. But if you don't, they have to listen. Her team sat still, letting the words settle. No one filled the silence. No one needed to. The moment had already spoken for itself. It wasn't about political affiliation. It wasn't about performance. It was about a deeper kind of strength, the kind that doesn't demand the spotlight but earns it anyway. As the city hummed on outside, and her phone kept lighting up with the chaos of a country grappling with what it had just seen, Michelle closed her eyes briefly, not out of exhaustion, but out of peace. And then, as the camera fades to black, a final voiceover emerges, not shouted, not dramatized, just spoken clearly, honestly. They tried to shame her, silence her, push her out, but in just 60 seconds, Michelle Obama reminded America, truth doesn't need volume, it only needs courage. The day after the rally, the country didn't wake up to policy headlines. It woke up to a pause, a collective stillness, like everyone had taken a breath they didn't realize they needed. Newsrooms scrambled to dissect what had happened in Dallas. Panels on cable shows debated whether Michelle's appearance was political strategy or personal conviction. Editorials ran with bold headlines, the 60 seconds that redefined disagreement, power without a podium, and when composure became a weapon of truth. On radio stations and podcasts across the spectrum, the conversation echoed one central question. Why did her silence say more than their shouting ever could? In one state house across the country, a senator, staunchly conservative, known for his fiery floor speeches, stood up during a committee meeting and shocked his colleagues with a simple reflection. "We saw what leadership looks like," he said, voice steady, eyes scanning the chamber. And it wasn't at the podium that night. There were no follow-up cheers, no dramatic declarations, just a slow, uncomfortable realization that something had shifted in the atmosphere. Something had broken through the noise. The final scene doesn't take place under bright lights or in front of microphones. It's not a press conference, not a victory lap. It's Michelle, walking through her neighborhood as the sun begins to dip behind the rooftops. She moves quietly, hands in her coat pockets, passing familiar porches and parked cars. No campaign signs line the fences, no news crews follow behind, just children playing down the block, a woman watering her front lawn, and an elderly man sitting on his steps who nods respectfully as she walks by. There's no need for applause here, no need for debate, because some moments don't need to be performed. They just need to be witnessed. And in that quiet, grounded stride, it's clear she's not walking away from the moment. She's walking it forward. The characters and events depicted in this story, including those named Michelle Obama and Donald Trump, are entirely fictional and do not represent real individuals or real-life events. This is a dramatized narrative created for storytelling and commentary purposes only. If this story moved you, inspired you, or made you think in a new way, please consider subscribing to my channel. Your support helps me continue writing and sharing more powerful stories that speak to justice, courage, and the truth that lives in all of us. Subscribe now and be part of stories that matter,